In the first days of July 2021, the town of Harmony Creek, a quiet agricultural community in Summit County, Ohio, was settling into the most scorching days of summer. The lives of the people here unfolded with a familiar, peaceful rhythm: mornings spent in the fields and afternoons gathered on porches with glasses of iced tea. No one could have imagined that in the midst of this tranquility, a horrifying crime and a shocking family tragedy were silently unfolding behind the closed doors of a familiar home. It all began on the 8th of the month when James Miller returned home from a week-long work trip to Cleveland. As he stepped into his yard, the first thing he noticed was an unusual silence. The modest, single-story house, which was always filled with the laughter of his wife and 3 young daughters, was now eerily quiet. James called out for his wife and children. From inside the house, his mother, Martha Miller, a woman in her late 50s, emerged. But contrary to the usual excitement she showed whenever her son returned from a trip, Martha's face today was etched with a weary sadness. His 3 daughters, the eldest only 6, rushed out after her. But they did not chatter and ask for presents as they usually did. They just clung silently to their grandmother's legs, their eyes wide with what looked like fear. James asked his mother why it was so quiet and where Maria was, a sense of unease creeping into his heart. Martha let out a long, heavy sigh. She led her son into the house, poured him a glass of water, and began to tell a story. She had carefully prepared a cruel and elaborate lie. She sniffled, dabbing at the corner of her eye with her sleeve, and told James that something terrible had happened while he was away for just 1 week. His wife, Maria, she explained, had left. James was stunned and asked what she was talking about and where Maria would go. Martha said, her voice laced with bitterness, that Maria had run off with another man. She claimed Maria had said the town was too poor and that James did not make enough money. Martha added that Maria was miserable because she could not give the family a son to carry on the Miller name. She told James that the whole time he was gone, she had seen Maria secretly taking phone calls and putting on makeup and nice clothes. She had tried to talk some sense into her, but Maria had just told her to mind her own business. Then, 3 days ago, Maria had packed her bags, taken the several $1,000s in savings they had scraped together, and just disappeared. Martha claimed that when she asked the girls, they said they saw their mommy get into a strange man's car. She lamented her fate as an old woman left with 3 little ones to care for, wondering how they were going to survive. She wept as she spoke, perfectly playing the part of a pitiful mother-in-law abandoned by her daughter-in-law. Hearing their grandmother, the 3 young children began to cry as well. But James Miller, who had lived with his wife for nearly 7 years, did not believe the story. His head was spinning, not from the shock of his wife having an affair, but from the utter absurdity of his mother's tale. He knew his wife, Maria Miller, very well. She was a kind, hard-working woman who never complained, no matter how difficult life got. The love she had for her 3 daughters was boundless. She would give up anything, but she would never be cruel enough to abandon her own children. And as for not being able to have a son, it was a sadness they both shared, but he had never once blamed or pressured her. He knew his mother, Martha. She was a woman with old-fashioned, patriarchal views who had always yearned for a grandson to carry on the family name. She frequently criticized her daughter-in-law over this. The tension between them in the house stemmed almost entirely from this issue. A vague suspicion, a dark premonition that some terrible truth was being hidden, began to form in James's mind. He tried to push the awful thoughts away and quickly pulled out his phone to call his wife. But all he heard was the long, hopeless ring before it went to a message that the subscriber was unavailable. He called all her close friends and relatives. No one had any news of Maria. His anxiety now morphed into real fear. He was certain his wife would not just leave on her own. Something terrible must have happened to her. After 2 days of searching for her himself in vain, James Miller decided to report the matter to the Summit County Sheriff's Department. He recounted the entire story, from his wife's disappearance to his mother's contradictory account. Recognizing that the case had complex elements and was not a simple matter of a person running away from home, the Summit County Sheriff's Department quickly launched an investigation. A task force, led by lead Detective Evans of the Criminal Investigation Division, was formed. As the first step, Detective Evans and his team went to James's home to gather information. The house also served as the location for a small, home-based business selling homemade sausages and meat pies, the family's main source of income. Martha Miller, as the primary witness, once again recounted the story of her daughter-in-law running off with another man, her face a mask of pitiable grief. She repeatedly blamed her son for bringing that woman into their lives, which made her story seem all the more credible. However, with the trained eye of a seasoned investigator, Detective Evans noticed cracks in her testimony. Her grief seemed performative, and at times, a fleeting look of anxiety and indescribable restlessness flickered in her eyes. The investigation was at risk of hitting a dead end, with no leads on Maria's whereabouts. All the police had was the highly questionable, one-sided testimony of the mother-in-law. The disappearance of Maria Miller was on the verge of becoming a cold case. The only statement the investigators had, from Martha Miller, was filled with too many contradictions and a chillingly unnatural calmness that made it impossible for Detective Evans and his team to trust. He believed the truth of the case was not in her deceitful words but was hidden somewhere within that very house, or in the fragile memories of the children. With that in mind, Detective Evans decided to take a crucial investigative step. He requested that a female deputy with experience in interviewing children be sent to speak privately with the victim's 3 daughters, especially the eldest, who was only 6. The conversation took place in a friendly environment, without the presence of the grandmother or other uniformed officers. The female deputy, posing as a teacher visiting the home, gently struck up a conversation, playing with the children. Only after building a sense of trust did she skillfully ask the eldest child, Anna. The deputy gently asked Anna if she missed her mommy and where she had gone, noting that she had not seen her for a few days. The 6-year-old girl, in her innocence, gave an answer that would change the entire course of the investigation. She whispered that her mommy was not gone, but sleeping. She added that her mommy was sleeping in Grandma's room. The deputy froze for a second but maintained her calm demeanor. She asked why mommy was sleeping in Grandma's room and if she was sleeping well. The girl continued, saying her mommy was sleeping very quietly. She said Grandma would not let them wake her up, explaining that mommy was tired and needed to sleep a lot. The child's innocent, clear words contained a horrifying truth. They completely contradicted the story of a runaway wife that Martha had fabricated. A mother could not be sleeping in her mother-in-law's room and also be considered a fugitive. While the child's words could not be considered legal evidence, they became a sharp needle that punctured Martha's web of lies and directed the investigation's suspicion squarely onto the mother-in-law. With suspicion at its peak, Detective Evans immediately ordered another team to canvass the entire area around the victim's home, specifically looking for any security cameras that might have captured important images. Luck was on their side. A neighbor's house across the street had a security camera pointed directly at the Miller's front gate. Although the image quality was not perfect, it was clear enough to record all comings and goings. The forensics team extracted all the camera data for the entire week James was away, the period when Maria was said to have run away. They spent a full day and night, taking turns, reviewing every minute and every second of the footage. And then, they found it, irrefutable proof. The footage showed that for that entire week, Maria Miller never once stepped out of the gate. She appeared on camera occasionally, sweeping the yard or playing with her children. But there was absolutely no scene of her carrying a suitcase, nor was there any sign of her getting into a strange car. The only person who regularly entered and exited the house was Martha Miller. In the morning, she would push her cart of sausages and pies out to sell, and in the afternoon, she would push it back home. This video was concrete evidence. It proved with 100% certainty that the story Martha told was a complete fabrication. Maria Miller had never left the house. That could only mean that something terrible had happened to her right inside that gate. And the only person present at the scene, the only one who had constructed a deceitful play, was none other than Martha Miller. The missing person case was immediately reclassified as a criminal investigation with signs of homicide. With the child's testimony and the evidence from the security camera, an emergency search warrant for the entire house and Martha's business area was approved by the Summit County Prosecutor's Office. Early the next morning, a large force from the Summit County Sheriff's Department and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation (BCI) was mobilized. They cordoned off the entire area and executed the search warrant. When Martha saw the warrant, her face turned pale, but she tried to remain calm, insisting that the police were wronging her. The search was conducted with extreme thoroughness. Every nook and cranny of the house was turned upside down. But the investigators found no trace of Maria. There was no suicide note, no signs of an unusual struggle. However, when the forensic team began their work, the true face of the crime scene slowly emerged. They focused on two areas: the bedroom of James and Maria, and the bathroom. To the naked eye, everything appeared clean. But when the lights in the house were turned off and the specialized chemical luminol was sprayed, a horrific sight appeared. Countless bright blue streaks, the indelible traces of blood lit up everywhere. In the bedroom, blood had spattered on the foot of the bed, on the wall, and was blotched across the floor. In the bathroom, the floor and the lower parts of the walls glowed almost entirely, indicating that this was where the killer had tried to scrub away a very large amount of blood. The crime scene had spoken. A bloody attack, a violent murder, had taken place right here. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, Martha Miller finally began to tremble, but she still refused to admit her guilt. The case had taken a decisive step forward. The perpetrator was almost certainly identified, and the murder scene had been found. But the biggest, most haunting question remained: where was the body of Maria Miller? A killer who could calmly and carefully clean a bloody murder scene like this must have also had a meticulous and cruel plan to dispose of the body. Detective Evans's gaze now turned to the back of the house, to an auxiliary kitchen where Martha prepared hundreds of sausages and meat pies for sale each day. A crazy hypothesis, a terrifying suspicion that he did not dare to entertain, began to form in his mind. With irrefutable evidence of a murder inside the house but with the victim's body mysteriously gone, the investigative team led by Detective Evans faced an incredibly difficult puzzle. The killer, almost certainly Martha Miller, had cleaned the bloodstains with a frightening level of calculation and composure. Someone capable of that would surely have an equally sophisticated plan for disposing of the body. Detective Evans walked around the perimeter of the property, his mind working at full capacity. All the usual theories, burying the body in the garden, throwing it into a river, hiding it in a well, were considered. But his gut feeling, honed by years of experience, told him that for a perpetrator with a psyche as abnormal as Martha's, the method of disposal would likely be unconventional. His eyes settled on the auxiliary kitchen at the back of the house. It was a rather makeshift structure with a tin roof, used as the space where Martha prepared her food for sale, separate from the main living quarters. Stepping inside, the distinct smell of cooked meat and spices hit him. Everything was arranged neatly, befitting someone who had been in the food business for years. There were large aluminum bowls, sacks of flour and dried onions, and several large chest freezers humming quietly. But the thing that caught Detective Evans's attention the most was a gleaming metal machine in the center of the kitchen. It was a large, industrial-grade meat grinder, a familiar tool of Martha's trade. Looking at the machine, a wild theory, a horrifying suspicion that he himself could not quite believe, flashed in his mind. He felt a cold chill run down his spine. He ordered the forensics team to search the area thoroughly, especially the meat grinder, and to check every single detail. The forensic examiners began their work. On the outside, the meat grinder looked perfectly clean. It had been carefully washed, with no suspicious traces. It seemed Detective Evans's theory was baseless, but he did not give up. His voice firm, he told them to take it apart and disassemble every component for inspection. Martha, who had been detained for questioning and was witnessing the entire search, suddenly became agitated when she saw the officers about to dismantle her meat grinder. She screamed, demanding to know what they were doing. She insisted that the machine was how the family made a living and that they had no right to destroy her property. Her over-the-top reaction only strengthened Detective Evans's suspicions. He signaled for his officers to continue. Using specialized tools, the forensics team began to take the machine apart. They removed the hopper and the auger. Everything inside was shiny and clean. It seemed Martha had been very thorough. But then, when they reached the final, most crucial component, the blade and plate assembly, a horrifying sight was revealed that left everyone present stunned. Wrapped around the hub of the grinder blade was a clump of long, dark hair. It was unmistakably human hair. And when they shone a forensic light deep into the crevices of the blade assembly, places that normal cleaning could never fully reach, they saw it. Countless tiny white and pinkish fragments, looking like pulverized meat and bone, were still stuck inside. A deathly silence fell over the kitchen. Everyone looked at each other, no one daring to voice the terrible suspicion that was now in everyone's mind. A young female forensic tech could not take it. She rushed outside and vomited. Even the seasoned examiners, who were accustomed to gruesome scenes, had to fight to suppress their shock. They carefully used tweezers to pick out every strand of hair and every tiny fragment, placing them into evidence bags. Under a magnifying glass, there was no doubt. The tiny white fragments were pieces of crushed human bone. Detective Evans took a small plastic bag containing the clump of long hair and slowly walked over to Martha. After seeing what was found inside her grinder, she could no longer stand steady. She was trembling violently, her face ashen. He did not need to say a word. He just held the plastic bag with the hair in front of her face. Seeing the undeniable proof of her crime, Martha Miller's false composure finally shattered. She let out a mournful scream and collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. In her delirium, she wailed, asking how they found it after she had cleaned it so carefully. That unintentional utterance, in her moment of collapse, was a confession. The crime scene had been illuminated in the most horrifying way imaginable. The victim, Maria Miller, had been murdered, and then the killer had used the very machine for her daily business to dispose of the body. This crime was beyond the limits of humanity. It was the act of a demon. But an even more terrifying question still hung in the air. If the killer had used a meat grinder to dispose of the body, where was the ground meat now? The eyes of Detective Evans and everyone present turned to the large chest freezers, which were filled with carefully packaged, finished sausages and meat pies, ready for the next day of sales. Detective Evans felt his throat go dry. He ordered his officers to seal the entire auxiliary kitchen, especially the freezers containing the finished products. A horrific question, one that no one dared to speak aloud, hung in the air. What percentage of the victim's body had been turned into these sausages and pies? Martha Miller's inadvertent confession in her moment of panic confirmed the investigative team's most horrifying suspicions. She was immediately taken to the sheriff's headquarters for interrogation. Meanwhile, the entire house and the auxiliary kitchen were strictly sealed. The collected samples, including the clump of hair, the fragments from the meat grinder, and especially the samples of finished sausages and pies taken from the freezer, were placed in specialized containers and rushed to the Ohio BCI crime lab for DNA analysis. The entire state of Ohio, and soon the entire country, was thrown into shock as the first details of the case were revealed. No one could believe that a seemingly gentle woman, the owner of a familiar local food business, could be the main suspect in a murder case with such barbaric details. Public opinion was in an uproar, and all eyes were on the investigators, awaiting the official forensic results of final confirmation of a truth that was too much to imagine. 48 agonizing hours passed, and then the expedited forensic report came back. It extinguished any last, faint glimmer of hope and confirmed an undeniable reality. The DNA results from the hair and the fragments found in the meat grinder were a 100% match to the DNA of the victim, Maria Miller, cross-referenced with samples from her parents and children. And the second result, the most horrifying of all, the analysis of randomly selected samples of the finished food products from the freezer also came back positive. The DNA of the victim, Maria Miller, was found mixed into the very sausages and pies that Martha had made to sell to her customers daily. In the interrogation room, faced with the two forensic reports placed on the table, faced with irrefutable scientific evidence, Martha Miller finally broke down completely. She no longer screamed or denied her guilt. She just sat there in silence for a long time, then began to confess to her entire crime. Her testimony was an indictment of archaic, backward ideologies and a simmering hatred that had been suppressed for years, only to erupt into an act of inhuman evil. With a flat, emotionless voice, she said yes, she had killed her. She had been waiting for this day for a long time. She confessed that her motive stemmed from a deep-seated hatred for her daughter-in-law. This hatred did not come from typical mother-in-law-daughter-in-law conflicts, but from a prejudice deeply ingrained in her consciousness, the absolute need for a son to carry on the family line. Her husband had died young, and she had toiled alone to raise James. James was her only hope, the one who would carry the torch for the entire Miller lineage. But Maria, the daughter-in-law in whom she had once placed her hopes, had given birth to 3 daughters in succession. To Martha, this was a humiliation, a profound disappointment. She believed that Maria was the one who had driven the Miller family to the point of extinction. That hatred grew with each passing day, suppressed beneath the facade of a normal mother-in-law, just waiting for an opportunity to explode. That opportunity came when James went on his business trip. She deliberately provoked an argument with her daughter-in-law, using the issue of childbirth as a pretext. The argument escalated. And when Maria, perhaps exhausted by years of her mother-in-law's criticism, talked back, the long-suppressed rage in Martha reached its peak. Martha said, her eyes flashing, that Maria had dared to talk back to her. She recounted how Maria had said that in this day and age, any child is a blessing. Maria had called her an old-fashioned, evil mother-in-law. She insulted her, and Martha could not control herself anymore. In a fit of madness, she had lunged at Maria, using all the strength of a woman accustomed to hard labor, and strangled her daughter-in-law until she stopped breathing. After the murder, the anger subsided, leaving only panic. But that fear was not stronger than her cruelty and hatred. She knew she had to get rid of the body. And then, in her sick mind, the most horrific plan of disposal was formed. She decided to make the daughter-in-law she despised literally disappear from the face of the earth. She recounted with chilling, methodical precision how she had dragged the body to the back kitchen. She had used the same knives she used every day to butcher pork to dismember her. The subsequent barbaric acts were described without a hint of squeamishness. All of the victim's flesh was stripped from the bones and fed into the industrial meat grinder, minced together with pork and various spices. Dozens of pounds of filling made from human flesh were created, which she then carefully packaged and stored in the freezer, mixed in with the normal batches. Detective Evans, his voice hoarse, asked about the bones. Martha smirked, a smile that made the skin crawl. She explained that she had a bone grinder, the kind she used to crush pig and chicken bones for animal feed. She had put all of Maria's bones in there and ground them into a fine powder. Then she mixed it with feed and gave it to the pigs, leaving no trace. She believed that with this method, no one would ever be able to find even a single piece of her daughter-in-law's bones. She was wrong. It was her confidence in her perfect crime, her carelessness in not thoroughly cleaning the meat grinder, that left behind the final strands of hair and the last fragments of DNA that exposed her entire monstrous act. The demon's confession had ended, but the tragedy remained. A husband was still waiting day and night for news of his wife. 3 innocent children were still asking where their mommy was. And dozens of pounds of sausages and pies, containing a part of the victim's body, were still in the freezer, a silent testament to an unforgivable crime, an evil that had transcended the very definition of human. Martha Miller's confession closed the investigative chapter of the case, but it opened an even more painful chapter of tragedy for those left behind, especially James Miller. He had to endure the worst days of his life, anxiously awaiting news of his wife, only to be confronted with a truth more horrific than death itself. Detective Evans was given the most difficult task, to inform James of the whole truth. In a small room at the sheriff's department, James, his face gaunt after many sleepless nights, still held onto a fragile sliver of hope. He hoped his wife was just angry and that she would soon come back. But when he saw the detective's solemn, pained expression, he knew the worst had come. Detective Evans began slowly, telling Mr. Miller that they had information about his wife, Maria. He expressed his deepest regret in having to inform him that she was no longer with them. The news of his wife's death was a massive shock that left James staggering. But the tragedy did not end there. With the most carefully chosen words, Detective Evans had to reveal an even crueler truth. He recounted the entire story of the conflict, of Martha's rage, and of her act of murder. James cried out that it was impossible, his eyes bloodshot. He insisted his mother could never do something like that and that there must be some mistake. He could not believe, did not dare to believe, that the mother he deeply respected, the woman who had toiled to raise him, could have murdered his own wife. But then, when Detective Evans was forced to tell him the final truth, the method of disposal, the meat grinder, the sausages, James Miller completely fell apart. He no longer screamed. He just sat there, catatonic, his eyes vacant, devoid of life. His world, his family, everything he held dear, had been utterly destroyed in an instant. His father had died young, now his mother was a murderer, and his wife had been killed and her body desecrated in the most barbaric way imaginable. The pain had not even begun to subside when James had to face an even more agonizing legal procedure. After completing the forensic work, the authorities had to return the victim's remains to the family for funeral arrangements. But there was no intact body. What they handed over to him was the entire stock of finished sausages and pies, carefully sealed in large styrofoam boxes, the very products that had been confirmed to contain his wife's DNA. James stood there, watching as the officers unloaded the boxes from a vehicle. Inside was all that was left of the wife he loved. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the cold packing tape sealing the boxes. The pain inside him could no longer be expressed with tears. It was a numbness, a paralysis that reached the very core of his soul. Organizing a funeral for Maria became an unprecedentedly tragic affair. James had to inform her family, her parents. They collapsed when they heard their daughter had been murdered by her own mother-in-law. They rushed from their hometown, their grief mixed with rage. But then they, too, had to face the agonizing question of how to bury someone when there is no body. What do you put inside the cold, empty coffin? After days of torment, James made a final decision, perhaps the only, and most painful, thing he could do for his wife. At the funeral, what was placed inside the coffin was not soil, as custom might dictate in some traditions, but the entire stock of those sausages and pies. The frozen packages were arranged neatly inside, along with a few sets of clothes that Maria had loved in life and their wedding photo. It was a final, desperate attempt to give his ill-fated wife a form, a semblance of a complete resting place. Maria's funeral took place on a sad, rainy afternoon. Everyone in Harmony Creek who heard the news was shocked and heartbroken. People came to pay their respects not just to offer condolences, but to witness the strangest and most tragic funeral they had ever seen. They looked at the coffin, and no one could hold back their tears. Most heartbreaking of all was the sight of the 3 little girls. They were too young to understand the tragedy that had befallen their family. The eldest, Anna, kept tugging on her father's sleeve, asking innocent questions about why her mommy was in that cold wooden box and why she could not see her one last time. Each question was like 1,000 knives stabbing into James's heart. He could only hug his children, his eyes welling with tears, unable to utter a single word. How would he ever explain it to them that their mother was gone, and that their grandmother, the woman they loved, was the one who had brutally murdered her? It was a truth too cruel, too much for their young souls to bear. The funeral ended, but the pain had just begun. His house was now cold and filled with grief. James Miller, once a man with a poor but happy family, had now lost everything. He was a widower, the son of a murderer, and a single father left to raise 3 orphan children. While James and his 3 young children faced a future filled with sorrow, elsewhere, the demon who caused all this tragedy, Martha Miller, awaited the final judgment of the law. After the investigation was completed with irrefutable evidence and a full confession, the Summit County Prosecutor's Office issued an indictment, charging the defendant, Martha Miller, with 2 extremely serious crimes, aggravated murder and gross abuse of a corpse. Due to the barbaric, inhuman nature of the crime, which had caused extreme public outrage, the trial of Martha Miller was held publicly at the Summit County Court of Common Pleas. On the day of the trial, the area around the courthouse was packed with curious onlookers and reporters. Security was at its highest level. Everyone wanted to see the face of the demon in the guise of a mother-in-law, the perpetrator of an unimaginable crime. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn and heavy. In the front row reserved for the victim's family, James Miller sat, his face haggard, his eyes hollow and soulless. Beside him were Maria's elderly parents, who had traveled from their hometown. The 2 old souls looked as if they might collapse from the pain of losing their daughter in such a horrific way. When the defendant, Martha Miller, was led into the courtroom, the entire room fell silent, followed by whispers and looks of utter contempt and disgust directed at her. Contrary to the image of a simple, hard-working sausage vendor, Martha in the defendant's box today had a cold, emotionless expression. She showed no fear or remorse, her gaze fixed emptily ahead. The trial began. After the prosecutor read the indictment, laying bare the entire chain of Martha's criminal acts, the court proceeded to the examination phase. Much of the trial was dedicated to presenting and analyzing the evidence. The prosecutor systematically laid out every detail. First was the innocent testimony of the 6-year-old daughter, recorded on video, with the haunting line about her mommy sleeping in grandma's room. Next was the security camera footage from the neighbor's house, the concrete proof that Maria never left, shattering the defendant's initial lies. And then, the most horrific evidence was presented. Photographs of the crime scene after being sprayed with luminol, showing the eerie blue glow of bloodstains splattered across the bedroom and bathroom. An image of the clump of long hair removed from the blade of the meat grinder. And finally, the DNA analysis report, with the definitive conclusion that the victim Maria Miller's DNA was found in the finished sausage and pie products. With each piece of evidence presented, gasps and murmurs of horror rippled through the courtroom. Disgust and outrage swelled in everyone present. When called to testify, Martha Miller did not deny her guilt. She admitted to all her actions. But her admission was not one of remorse, it was an affirmation of her crime, a justification for her blind hatred. The presiding judge asked if the defendant recognized that her actions were wrong and that they violated the law. Martha replied with a defiant voice, devoid of emotion, that she knew. But she insisted that Maria could not give her a grandson and was going to let the Miller family name die out. She declared that a daughter-in-law who could not produce an heir did not deserve to live. She had only done what had to be done to remove a thorn in her side and the shame of her family. The defendant's cold, inhuman words enraged the entire courtroom. Even the judge, who had presided over hundreds of cases, had to frown at the hardened, depraved nature of this woman. Moving to the closing arguments, the prosecutor stood and delivered a powerful indictment. He declared to the court and jury that they were not just trying a murder case, but a crime against humanity itself. He argued that the defendant, Martha Miller, driven by an archaic and blind obsession with male heirs, had nurtured a deep-seated hatred for her own daughter-in-law for years. The prosecutor stated that the defendant not only brutally took the victim's life, but she also committed an act of desecration against the body with a method beyond imagination. She used her daily work tools and her skills in making food to turn her daughter-in-law into an ingredient for the products she sold. This, he argued, was an act not only of physical barbarity but also of ultimate humiliation, a damnation of the soul of the deceased. Such an act could not be tolerated in any civilized society. The prosecutor concluded that with the act she had committed, the defendant had shown that she was beyond rehabilitation. He called her a toxic blight on society and requested that the court impose the highest penalty prescribed by law. The defense attorney, appointed to represent Martha, had almost no arguments to make. Faced with such overwhelming evidence and the defendant's unfeeling attitude, the lawyer could only mention her difficult background and low level of education, hoping the court might consider them as mitigating factors, more as a formality than anything else. After the arguments concluded, the judge announced that the jury needed time to deliberate. The court recessed. Martha Miller was let out, her face still an icy mask. The legal battle was over. Now, everyone waited in silence. No one doubted her guilt anymore. The only remaining question was what sentence would be passed for a crime that had surpassed the limits of human decency. After about an hour of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on the jury foreperson, awaiting the final verdict that would seal the fate of the demon in a mother-in-law skin and bring a close to one of the most horrifying cases in the state's history. The defendant, Martha Miller, was led back to her place. Her face remained cold and emotionless, showing no sign of anxiety or fear. The judge, an older man with silvering hair, stood with dignity and began to read the verdict. His voice was clear and measured, but every word carried the weight of justice and outrage. He began by stating that after a full and objective review of the entire case file and the evidence presented, the court found the criminal conduct of the defendant to be of an exceptionally grievous nature, posing an extreme danger to society. Motivated solely by an archaic, backward, and blind prejudice, the defendant had cruelly taken the life of her daughter-in-law. The judge emphasized that the defendant's actions did not stop at murder. Afterward, she had used the very tools of her trade to desecrate the victim's body in a manner that was barbaric, cruel, and devoid of all humanity. The act of turning a part of a human body into food to be sold was not only a crime against the victim but also an insult to and a trampling upon the moral values of their entire society. This crime had caused a horrifying trauma to the community with immeasurable consequences. He noted that before the court, the defendant had shown not a shred of remorse and still believed her actions were justified. This demonstrated that her moral depravity had reached its absolute limit and that she was beyond the possibility of rehabilitation. Therefore, it was necessary to apply the most severe punishment to permanently remove her from society, ensure justice for the deceased, and serve as a deterrent. After analyzing all the facts, the judge delivered the final sentence. The courtroom held its breath. Pursuant to the provisions of the Ohio Revised Code, the court sentenced the defendant, Martha Miller, to death for the crime of aggravated murder. The death sentence was pronounced, clear and firm. A wave of reaction went through the courtroom. Below, James Miller bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with choked sobs. Maria's parents hugged each other, crying in pain, but also with a sense of belated solace. Justice had finally been served. Upon hearing the death sentence, Martha Miller's icy facade finally cracked. She froze for a moment, as if she could not believe her own ears. But she quickly regained her hardened expression, allowing the court officers to handcuff her and lead her away. The life of the demon in the guise of a pitiable woman had officially come to an end. The case was closed, but the tragedy and pain it left behind would endure. James Miller, the most tragic figure in this case, had lost everything. His wife was murdered by his own mother in the most brutal way imaginable. His mother was now a death row inmate awaiting her fate. His family was completely shattered. This pain would likely follow him for the rest of his life. Martha's Sausage and Pie Shop, once a familiar spot for locals, was now sealed, its doors and windows shut. It became a haunting place, a silent monument to a horrific crime that no one dared to approach. Some say that on late nights, you can still hear the sorrowful cries of a young woman echoing from within. But the greatest, most painful tragedy is the fate of the 3 young children. They have forever lost their loving mother. They have also lost their grandmother. They are still too young to understand the terrible truth of what happened. As they grow up, they will have to face a future full of sorrow, bearing a scar and a sense of shame that nothing can ever erase. How will they live on, knowing that their grandmother killed their mother and that a part of their mother's body was turned into sausages and pies? It is a question too horrifying to contemplate, a tragedy with no end. The case of the sausage shop murder will forever remain one of the darkest files in criminal history. It is a costly lesson on the dangers of extreme, archaic beliefs and a painful testament to how human hatred, when pushed to its limits, can turn people into monsters more savage than any beast.